No idea. We've got, it's already revisit. We will post it on the Holocaust Studies website. So hello, welcome. My name is Mark Doyle. I'm a professor in the history department here at MTSU. And I want to begin by acknowledging the support of our sponsors at MTSU, the history department, the philosophy and religious studies department, the sociology and anthropology department, and the Holocaust Studies Committee. Today's talk, it's on a topic that obviously cuts across all those disciplines that I just mentioned and more. So it's great to have such a nice range of sponsors. Today, we're delighted to welcome Ken Stern virtually to Middle Tennessee. Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, an attorney and an award-winning author. For 25 years, he was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism, and he was also the lead drafter of the working definition on anti-Semitism, which has been the basis for some recent laws prohibiting anti-Semitism, including one that's currently making its way through the Tennessee legislature and not entirely unproblematically, as I think we'll hear. He's been involved in several high visibility legal cases, including working as part of the defense team in the libel suit brought against Deborah Lipstadt by Holocaust denier David Irving. He's written a number of books on hate and extremism, including the National Book Award nominated A Force Upon the Plain about the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. His most recent book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, is a lucid and timely analysis, and a really good read, on how extreme partisanship around the issue of Israel-Palestine has become a threat to academic freedom and rational inquiry on college campuses and beyond. The title of today's talk is Anti-Semitism Today, Censorship, Conspiracy, and the Dangers of Hate. Ken will speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions with the aim of wrapping up around 4 p.m. or possibly a little later, depending on how the discussion develops and how much time Ken has to devote to us. So just type any questions or comments that you have into the Q&A box. As I said, I've also got the chat open. And I'll monitor all that and relay questions to Ken as time allows. Okay, and I'll be quiet now and hand things over to Ken Stern.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for that kind introduction. And I'm sorry I can't be with you all today, but I look forward to this conversation. You asked me to address a number of questions about anti-Semitism. I teach a full semester class on it, and even then we don't have time to cover it all. So today we're only going to scratch the surface, but I hope some main principles will be clear. And I look forward to the question and answer section when I can hear more about what's on your minds. And I know if we were in person, there are some people who might not feel comfortable asking me something publicly, but will ask me something privately thereafter. So I'm happy for anyone who has a question or would like to talk anytime. For example, if you have a paper next semester, to email me, and my email is kstern@bard.edu. So Mark's questions about anti-Semitism. What is it? Why does it persist? How does it manifest today? And what are the factors that can influence our ability to combat it? And I sometimes speak about these exact issues in Jewish communal spaces. The last time I spoke at a synagogue in person was at 2 Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day events in the last spring before COVID in 2019. I commented, of course, on the awful attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that had happened months before. And then just days before Yom HaShoah, another at the Chabad Synagogue in Poway, California. And I started off both talks with some condensed sentences from John Earnest's manifesto. He was the Poway shooter, and he posted them shortly before his attack. He justified his attack the way most anti-Semites who commit acts of terror do, in self-defense. Here's what he wrote. What value does my life have compared to the entirety of the European race? Is it worth it for me to live a comfortable life at the cost of international Jewry sealing the doom of my race? Every Jew is responsible for the meticulously planned genocide of the European race. Every Jew, young and old, for these crimes they deserve nothing but hell. At one event before I spoke, there were Hebrew school students who were reading newspaper clips, some from then recent anti-Semitic hate crimes here and abroad. and one's from the Nazi era. And I couldn't tell if the students were making a comparison or were their teachers stressing the differences, that the Nazi attacks on Jews were by a state, and here, single people motivated by hate. At the other event, they showed a short film, very good short film, from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum called Hate and Anti-Semitism. And that raises the question, what's the relationship between the two? Jewish organizations rightly complain when anti-Semitic attacks occur and the condemnation is of racism or hatred more generally. I recall a meeting with a minister from France in the early 2000s when synagogues were being attacked there, and he blamed it all on hooligans. But why then were only synagogues, not churches or mosques, being hooliganized? The French minister's response, I thought, was an attempt to disguise the anti-Semitism, to render it invisible. And this sometimes happens for political reasons. But I think the flip side is the more important. One can't understand anti-Semitism outside of a framework of understanding hatred. It's not like anti-Semitism is the only type of hatred in the world, and we look at it in isolation, at our peril. So here's an example. We all think of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh as anti-Semitism, of course. No one would classify the shooting of Mexicans and Mexican Americans at the Walmart in El Paso a few months later as anti-Semitism. But the two shooters had essentially the same white supremacist ideology, fearing brown-skinned people coming from the southern border. They just chose a different target. One targeted Jews because he thought Jews helped make this happen. A pro-immigration group had met at the Pittsburgh synagogue shortly before the shooting. And the Texas shooter decided to target Mexicans and Mexican Americans directly. We use too narrow a lens when we look at anti-Semitism as a totally isolated phenomenon, although like all forms of hate, it does have its unique aspects. So let's discuss hate first, and how we think about it and how we don't think about it. Some of you may recall the line from the musical South Pacific that we have to be carefully taught to hate. In other words, there's no hatred unless somehow we're polluted. I think we may need help to identify who to hate, but hatred is hardwired as part of the human condition. Years ago, when I was at the American Jewish Committee and there was a hate crime, we'd publish an ad showing cute babies of different skin colors with the caption, "No one is born hating." While cute, I actually hated that poster for the message it sent. No one is born speaking either. But if they don't, after a while, we think that there's something wrong. And as I said, there's evidence that we're hardwired or at least pre-wired for hate. Think about it. Hate, no matter when, no matter where, no matter what economic system or political system or major religion, we've always had it throughout history. We are primed to see in us and a them. And hate studies tries to bring an interdisciplinary approach to understanding this phenomenon, like we do with other aspects of the human condition. Think about it. Medicine is what? It deals with the human fact that people get sick. So it brings together biology and chemistry and physics to answer the need for what do we do about curing illness. Architecture is a combination of what? Physics, math, and art, because we need structure. So there's a lot of various insight from different academic fields about hatred, but we too often look at it in isolation. And the goal of hate studies is, like with medicine and architecture and other fields, to bring the advantages of an interdisciplinary lens to this issue. So what is hate studies? It's defined as inquiries into the human capacity to define and then dehumanize or demonize and quote other, and the processes which inform or give expression to, or can curtail, control, or combat that capacity. And I'm happy in the Q&A section to answer questions about what the hate studies field is and what it's producing. And if anybody on your campus wants to build a hate studies initiative, I'm happy to work with you on how to do it. But today, I just want to share some insights from the component fields with you because they're clearly related to how we understand anti-Semitism. As I said, we're programmed to see in us and in them. Evolutionary psychology, for example, looks at, one example would be, the fact that if we think rationally about it, we're more likely to be harmed by an automobile than a snake or a spider. But our reaction to snakes and spiders are much more, visceral than to cars, right? Well, a lot of that is because our brain evolved millennia ago when snakes and spiders and were a danger, and clearly automobiles were not. Brain science, I mean, amazing to me, since the 25 years since hate studies has been percolating and growing, we can now put somebody in a MRI and look at different parts of their brain function. If they hate somebody or they don't, they're showing rapid pictures of people in different races. Social psychology has a tremendous amount of this. Just to give you one example, if we were in person, I could flip a coin and divide the audience into group A and group B. And after a group identity was formed, even though everybody in each group knew the assignment was totally random, each group would feel that its members were smarter, more attractive, and so forth. That's just the way we're programmed to look at the world. We also crave simplicity. We definitely want to reduce complex things to black and white and good and bad. It's easier for us. It's less taxing for us to do so. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist who teaches at the NYU Business School, wrote a book a few years ago called The Righteous Mind. And a couple of points from that book are germane to this discussion. He says there are two different kinds of cognition, intuiting and reasoning. And he describes the process of dealing with the world and how we think. He uses a metaphor of an elephant and a rider. And what he's basically saying is that our emotions, our instincts, how we intuit is the elephant, and our reasoning is the rider. We can steer the elephant somewhat, but basically we're along for the ride. He also noted that if you ask people to believe something that violates their intuitions, they'll devote their efforts to finding an escape hatch. Related to that, he also found that partisanship is addictive. He said the sacredness of symbols help bind a people into a moral community. Moral psychology has a role in understanding this too. And he said people bind themselves together into political teams that share moral narratives. Once they accept it, and once they accept a particular narrative, they become blind to alternative moral worlds. He also posits that anything that binds people together in a moral matrix that glorifies the in-group while at the same time demonizing the other group can lead to moralistic killing. And he said that many religions are well suited for this task. Morality, he points out, both binds people together and blinds them to other realities. And it's especially so when there's a perceived threat to identity, and particularly so even more when that threat to identity is wrapped in an issue of social justice or injustice. Again, it's easier to see things in black and white than ponder the complexities and to put them into moralistic terms. For example, neo-Nazi David Duke, professed that he doesn't hate black people. He just loved white folk. The Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, despite his anti-Semitism, homophobia, and anti-white racism, says he doesn't hate white folk. He just loves black people and is looking out for them. Our group, their group, I love my group, and the vilification of others isn't seen that way frequently. It's seen as something noble. I'm sure you've also noted that proponents of genocide and other attacks on whole peoples have justified their views as a matter of self-defense too. Nazis were, in their view, defending themselves from the evil Jews. And just look at what's been coming out of Putin's mouth in the last month plus more. The craving for simplicity, black and white, us and them, symbols, so forth, means that we sometimes see the world through lenses that invite conspiracy theories because they are simple plug-and-play ways to look at the world. And anti-Semitism fits into this neatly. It's a classic us-them view of the world. What is anti-Semitism? At heart, it's two things. It's conspiracy theory about Jews trying to harm non-Jews, and it provides an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. And it exists on the political right and on the political left. And it's useful to think of it as having three types, although of course these different types overlap. They all have similar characteristics. Let's go through a little bit of the history. The oldest is the religious aspect of anti-Semitism. Jews today, by the way, are a people, not just a religion, but the religion is the core part of Judaism. And at the time anti-Semitism began, Jews were seen as just that, a religion. And especially in the early days of Christianity, a competitor one. Christianity appears on the scene, but Jews rejected it. Jews rejected Jesus. Jews rejected a societal truth. What happens if you reject a societal truth? Jews became shunned, and an example of what happens if you reject a societal truth. They were kept in ghettos, They were discriminated against, they were expelled, they were targeted in the Crusades and the Inquisitions, and the conspiracy theories grew along with these atrocities. There was the blood libel, the charge that Jews take Christian babies and drain their blood for making Passover matzah. So sometimes when a Christian child disappeared, that was the explanation. The Black Plague, the reason? Jews were poisoning wells, or so it was said. Conspiracy theory, blaming Jews for harming non-Jews and explaining things that go wrong in the world. Then in the 1880s, anti-Semitism developed a racial component. Jews, of course, aren't a race. There are white Jews and black Jews and Jews from Arab countries. But at the time of Darwin and the aftermath, the idea of race came to the fore, and Jews, by many people, were seen as a race. And before, as I said, it was only a religion. But if it's a religion, you can theoretically convert out. If it's a race, you can't. Nazism is the greatest examples of trying to kill Jews and making that a noble goal, and in racial terms. And even if you had one Jewish grandparent, even if you had no knowledge, you had one Jewish grandparent, but they discovered it, you were considered Jewish and targeted. It was also the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery that propelled many of the pogroms against the Jews in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Europe. And this was supposedly a book that showed that Jews control the media, control the government, control the world. And it was promoted in the United States by a mainstream person, Henry Ford. This is the way to look at the world, to understand it. Robert Rifkin, who's a noted lawyer and had been president of the American Jewish Committee, had a talk at a conference. I want to read you a paragraph from, because it encapsulates a lot of these types of theories. This is: in every age, hatred of Jews has been explained in terms that made perfect sense to the populace at the time. We have been told that anti-Semitism was understandable by reason of Jews' responsibility for the death of God, or the ritual murder of Christian youth, or for poisoning of wells. Hatred of Jews has been ascribed to the perception that Jews are rich, blood-sucking moneylenders, or miserably poor rag pickers. They are arrogant separationists or pushy assimilationists, that they are capitalists or communists. They are historical fossils or avatars of unwelcome modernity. They are timid, unmanly weaklings or stormtroopers, and they are landless cosmopolitans or now Jewish nationalists. Such supposed explanations, however fervently believed, however obvious they may seem, are symptoms of anti-Semitism and not its cause. And we've even had in the last year or so another addition to the tropes of Jewish conspiracy, Marjorie Taylor Greene retweeting that Jews in their space lasers were responsible for California forest fires. Again, Jews conspire to harm non-Jews, and explaining what goes wrong in the world is what anti-Semitism does. And there's a third type, which is political, though all of them are political in one way or another. And this is about Israel, and it's the most complex. Clearly, it's anti-Semitic when one transfers the tropes of Jewish conspiracy to the Jewish state. Some tropes, for example, like Jews are the source of all misfortune in the world, Israel or Zionism is the source of all misfortune. It's also anti-Semitic to attack Israel simply because it is Jewish. But hate studies helps us explain why the debate over so much about Israel is difficult and why we're unhappy with the complexity. How many times in the news has someone made a statement related to Israel and people either want to charge them as anti-Semitic or exonerate them? And this also explains why some on the left are blind to anti-Semitism when people have some views of Israel, the same views of Israel as they do. Some on the right too. It's black, white, good, bad, binary thinking. It's comforting and moral satisfying. In my latest book that Mark mentioned, I even have examples of each side of the campus debate over Israel smugly claiming the other side are veritable Nazis. The reality on this type of anti-Semitism is that there are few, if any, bright lines. I worry about efforts like the bill that's going through the Tennessee legislature on anti-Semitism to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism, a definition of which, by the way, I was a lead drafter, but it was for entirely different purposes. They would try to impose these bright lines, and I believe despite the intent of the legislators, such a bill actually makes combating anti-Semitism more difficult. I don't want to devote much time to that issue here, but I'll have some comments later when we talk about what to do and not do about anti-Semitism. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions. So when we think about anti-Semitism, There are some myths that we shouldn't critically accept and other things that we should consider. Myths. First, sometimes we think, it's just stupid people that are anti-Semitic, and that's not true. If you look at history, the Ku Klux Klan was anti-Semitic to its core, for example, but at the time that the KKK was at its heyday in the civil rights era, in the 50s and 60s, there were white citizens councils in the South made up of bright, successful business folk who were also promoting similar ideas. Bright people can hate, perhaps even better. Then there's a myth that it's all about economics. Some say anti-Semitism is a function of economic downturn, but think about it historically. Anti-Semitism in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, before the Depression, the Ku Klux Klan had 40,000 ministers in it. It had a huge march in Washington, D.C. It influenced the policies in state houses in many parts of the country. Anti-Semitism at its core is about ideas. So how do we think about the level of anti-Semitism, gauge it? When we hear stories of anti-Semitism rising, what exactly do we mean? How do we gauge it at any particular moment? And I believe it's distorting to do so in isolation without historical reference or comparison. So part of the calculus is how do we understand contemporary anti-Semitism is hate crimes. They're up in most recent years, although sometimes down. But hate crimes against Jews are mostly against property and other nonviolent incidents, synagogue, desecration, cemetery, swastikas on tombstones. But despite Pittsburgh and some recent events, it's mostly about property, not about people. I had to say that stat was misquoted in the legislative debate earlier this week in Tennessee, where it said Jews are the greatest victim of hate crime. That's not true. They are the most victimized religious group. Hate crimes targeted by race and ethnicity make up about 62% of the total, religion only about 13%, and the number of reported hate crimes against Jews actually went down in 2020, the last year that stats are available, from 683 to 683 from 963 the year before. And of course, the hate crime data is always incomplete, but that's another matter. In any event, hate crime is one metric. Then there are attitudes. About 10% of the people in the United States agree with 6 or more of 11 questions about Jews that are negative stereotypes. They engage in shady business practices or are shrewd in businesses so that others don't stand a chance, and so forth. There's a problem when we're looking at this data in isolation. For example, years ago, there was a Roper poll that 18% said Israel had too much control and influence over government policies. But 39% said labor unions had too much control, and 46% said Arab oil nations. So it's always important to look at numbers in comparison. I argue, however, that still at the moment we're at one of the best times when it comes to anti-Semitism. Think back 22 years ago to 2000. The largest Jewish communal issue at the time was what? Intermarriage. Jews were literally being loved to death, and the fear was that Jews would disappear. That was the same year Joe Lieberman ran for vice president, and some leaders in the Jewish community said, anti-Semitism is virtually dead. Then a year or two later, the peace process collapsed and the Second Intifada began, and there were attacks on Jews, particularly in Europe, and they escalated significantly. And some people in the Jewish community, just 2 years after saying anti-Semitism disappeared, is saying we're returning to the 1930s. Neither is true. 1930s? My parents and grandparents lived in a time when there were restrictive covenants of what Jews could buy and not buy. And there were refusals to let Jews stay in certain places or join certain clubs. And there were anti-Jewish quotas in colleges. That's obviously not the case anymore. There are so many Jewish college professors and even Jewish college presidents. Another gauge, as I mentioned, is intermarriage. But we still have these horrid incidents. We've had Buford Furrow, who shot up the JCC, Jewish Community Council building in Jewish Community Center, actually, in Los Angeles in 1999, wounding 3 Jewish children before killing a Filipino postal worker. There was the murder of a guard at the Holocaust Museum. There were attacks on Jewish, was supposed to be on Jewish people. Non-Jewish folk got killed in Kansas City a few years ago. There was the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue massacre, the Poway shooting, and more recently, of course, the Colleyville synagogue hostage taking. But when one person attacks something Jewish or not, or chooses not to do that, it's hard to extrapolate too much from one incident if they choose to do something or not on one particular day. But what's the relationship of these types of incidents with the larger picture? It's an important consideration, I think, is between what's different between what's on the extreme and what's in the mainstream. In the height of the militia movement in the 1990s, a friend who worked with a human rights group in Montana described the militia as a funnel moving through space. He said at the large end of the funnel, there were people coming in from mainstream issues, gun control, land use planning, and so forth. And once they were sucked inside this funnel, they were exposed to conspiracy theories. And then the further they got sucked in, anti-Semitic ones. And then out of the small end of the funnel were people who were giving their entire identity over to these anti-Semitic and other conspiracy theories. You know, people who were like Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. And the beauty of the metaphor of my friend Ken Toole from Montana is it suggests a system. It suggests that the more people you plunge into the large end, the more will emerge out of the small end of the system. And that's, of course, something we should be concerned about, because anti-Semitism plays out best when we're in a system that's propelled to push people into this by mainstreaming the us versus them type of thinking. When Trump was president, a friend, a Columbia University professor named Sam Friedman, who used to write for the New York Times, was now working on a book about Hubert Humphrey, the 1948 Democratic Convention, wrote an op-ed about a term apparently used by Walter Winchell. He used it to describe Gerald L.K. Smith, probably one of the best-known anti-Semites of the 1940s and a contemporary of Humphrey's. Smith, it was asserted, was engaged in patriotism, a marriage, a blending with hate and patriotism. And that describes a lot of what we saw in the Trump era. We have to defend ourselves. It's patriotic and hate at the core of it. His campaign announcement that Mexicans are rapists, then floating the idea that Muslims had to register. And then when he was in office, that some fine people with those with tiki torches, Confederate flags, and swastikas at Charlottesville. White supremacists believed they were empowered. What's more mainstream than what a president says? But think about it. Why did white supremacists in Charlottesville protesting the removal of Confederate monuments say Jews will not replace us? They believe themselves superior to non-whites, yet they believe they are losing. The US is projected to be majority non-white in a few decades. And how do you make sense of losing to somebody that you see as an inferior? There has to be some unseen hand, the Jews conspiring to harm non-Jews, and anti-Semitism for an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. Kathleen Blee, a sociologist, is also an expert witness of the recent civil case holding some of the Charlottesville folk responsible for damages, wrote a book years ago about women in the Klan. And she said that they came to their racism and anti-Semitism differently. For racism, there's usually a story, who knows if it's true or not, and somebody's on a bus and they hear a young black person playing a radio loud, and that's how I knew I don't like black people. With Jews, it was more of, aha, now I understand how the world really works. So, given all this, I'm convinced our ability to fight anti-Semitism in all types of hate correlates with something that's critically important that we don't think about enough, the strength of our democracy. The erosion of democratic infrastructure is usually not visible, like the erosion of highways and other things that rust until they collapse. The erosion of our democratic traditions precedes Trump, but he accelerated it with attacks on the judiciary, political enemies, including those concerned about refugees, as treasonous, the press is the enemy of the people, and so on. And now, of course, the whole conspiracy theory about stolen elections. There's a major danger of anti-Semitism today in the empowerment of haters by those with power and those seeking power. When I spoke synagogues while Trump was president, and people asked me if I thought he was anti-Semitic because he used classic images of the Jewish star and money in his campaign against Hillary Clinton, or when he referred to Israel as, quote, your country, speaking to a Jewish audience, I told them I didn't know, and I really didn't care. I was much more concerned about his hateful attacks on Muslims and immigrants than what he said about Jews. When leaders encourage people to see fellow human beings as a them, the conspiracy of anti-Semitism is likely to be empowered. So some other concluding comments. On Israel, it's wrong to give a free pass to people with whom we agree. The Zionist Organization of America, for example, feted Steve Bannon, who was responsible for a lot of the alt-right because he was, quote, a friend of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, former prime minister of Israel, praised Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, because Orban was a, quote, friend of Israel. But you look at Orban's election campaigns, they're overtly anti-Semitic. They're focused on big posters of George Soros. It's cut and pasted from how anti-Semites have ascribed evil and almost magical powers to some other Jews in history. And those who ignore anti-Semitism from particular from their personal allies is done at our peril, again, especially done by leaders. And this is also something that happens on the left. I've seen some tropes by progressives about Jews and money or Jews and power that could have come out of the mouth of a right-winger like Pat Buchanan, and those who would have criticized Buchanan were reticent to say anything when the person who dabbled in the trope shared their view on Israel. So we have to be consistent and not pull our punches or beat up on somebody just because we disagree on Israel. We have to also be smarter in what we do. There are some non-governmental organizations that do good work, but what are their gauges? How do they think through? And how do they know that what sounds good and maybe actually helpful to gain fundraising support really works? We need more guidance and theories and evaluation. Here's an example that's a stark reality that I don't know anybody has the answer to, but it's important to try to find some. Hate in politics works. Otherwise, politicians wouldn't use it. And I think they use it better now. We're more fragmented into us, them world with the different buckets of cable news and especially with social media. So what's the nexus of theories of hate and what those who combat anti-Semitism should do? How do we think about what works on an individual level, what works on a cultural level, what works on a societal level, and a political level? That's part of what the field of hate studies and the Bard Center that I run is focusing on and trying to come up with tools to help. But we need to take some, in addition to what we need to do, we have to take some critical looking at conventional wisdom that also may be wrong. The usual Jewish community default for anti-Semitism is Holocaust education. Now, don't get me wrong, I serve on a committee at the Holocaust Museum. Holocaust education is important, but I submit it's not a default or too easy an answer for combating anti-Semitism. Let me give you some things to think about. For example, young Arab and Muslims in France see images of Israelis with guns toting over fellow Muslims and Arabs. Do we really think that having them sit in class and learning about the Nazi conference at Wannsee and other parts of the history of Nazi Germany is going to work about anti-Semitism? Further, there was a tremendous amount of hate and anti-Semitism at the UN's World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, so much so that the US even pulled out. People used the language of the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing and such, and turned it around to target not only Israel, but Jews. There were things praising Hitler and promoting the protocols of the Elders of Zion there. And now the go-to remedy for anti-Semitism seems to be the definition of anti-Semitism, written, as I said, for entirely different purposes. And I'm happy to discuss it in detail, but it was primarily designed to help data collectors in Europe take the temperature of anti-Semitism across times and borders, not to have sharp definitions for educational institutions, so what's okay and what may get you in trouble for saying. I watched the video of the passage of the Tennessee House bill. It's clear from the discussion and the vote that the legislators had little idea of what the bill meant or what it could do. They thought they were opposing anti-Semitism, who'd object to that, and no one did. But by misusing a definition that's been employed to target some pro-Palestinian speech as anti-Semitism, it harms our ability to actually fight anti-Semitism. We wouldn't want a legislature to define racism for a campus in a similar way, taking data points relevant to taking the temperature of racism, many of them political, like opposing the removal of Confederate statues or promoting affirmative action or opposition to Black Lives Matter, and then take these points and adopt them legislatively as a definition of a type of hate. The anti-Semitism definition includes examples about Israel, not to label anyone as anti-Semitic, but as a realization there are certain things said about Israel that can correlate with an increase in anti-Semitism, not to cause it, but to correlate with it, as we saw last spring during the war in Gaza. Definitions distort and make complex things simple, and anti-Semitism is not a matter of putting a statement into a formula and coming out with a conclusion. Anti-Semitism is a consistent worldview, but as any hateful ideology, it's not just a matter of rational thought, but empowering ideas and emotions of identity. At the extremes, people commit acts of violence and do so because they believe it is self-defense. It's a statement I read from Ernest at the beginning illustrates. But we do know some things. When binary thinking, especially conspiracy theory, becomes more fashionable and normative, especially when promoted by leaders, it's the culture in which hate and anti-Semitism is most likely to grow. It also worries me today that we have less respect for the value of freedom of speech and academic freedom. This isn't a new debate entirely. There were attempts, for example, years ago to stop neo-Nazis from marching at Skokie, Illinois. But we again default to black-white censoring or permitting, and historically, I worry whenever we give government the power to stop any speech, including anti-Semitic speech. Look around the world today. Look at Russia, look at China, look at Hong Kong, look at so many places where you see authoritarian regimes stopping speech or chilling speech, or look in the US history during the McCarthy era and during World War I. Free speech is important for all of our human rights. And so, as a child of the 50s and 60s, it was important for the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. It's the government trying to suppress speech that was for those things. And that's why I worry about this bill that passed in the Tennessee House. As I said, the intentions were good, but the enshrining of a definition of anti-Semitism laws, especially given the track record of how this one has been used to curb speech about Israel. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A section. So I'm not saying to ignore anti-Semitic speech. I'm saying there are much better approaches that disappear when we try to just put a definition and forget about it. Counter speech, for example. Here's a particular example of counter speech that I found very effective. A few years ago, there was a neo-Nazi group that was going to march in Western Montana. They had threatened the Jewish community and the human rights community there. They're going to have an armed march on Martin Luther King Day, bringing up skinheads from the Oakland area. And I worked with a human rights group there, and what we did was something called Project Lemonade. So it's not going to stop them from marching, but let's not make their speech anything but free. We went online through social media and got people to pledge money if these folks ended up marching, tied to how much money they would give to how long these folks marched. So the money would go to things these folks detested, would go to security for the people that they were threatening, would go to hate crime training, to anti-bias education, and so forth. So they'd be raising money for things that they really abhor. They ended up not marching. People on the ground there felt supported by people around the world, and it gave people around the world something concrete that they can do. So they turned everything on its head, and there are many more examples of how we can use counter speech much more effectively to combat anti-Semitism and other types of hate. Finally, recently, a former leader of a major Jewish agency asked me what works to combat anti-Semitism, and he was just looking at simple things, what people were saying about Jews, and that's it. We need a much larger lens if we're going to be effective. We need to oppose things and make conspiracy theories generally more acceptable. We have to support groups that promote civil liberties, free speech, and democracy, even where you may disagree with them from time to time. And this means if government is doing something designed as an official act like legislation to define what opinions, and I'm not talking about things like harassment, intimidation, and discrimination, but opinions are okay and which should be suppressed or killed, even if you don't like those opinions being targeted, it's essential to fight against this impulse to censor. As I've said, we've seen too many examples in US history, including the McCarthy era and World War I, and too many examples around the world today of punishing expressions of opinion, and we don't want to do that too. That erodes democracy, period. In conclusion, we have to, in my view, resist the temptation to look for anti-Semitism with a microscope, focus only on what someone says about Jews. Anti-Semitism historically grows in an environment and culture where democracy is under threat, where leaders scapegoat any group, and when conspiracy theories become the norm. Anti-Semitism can only be fought well if we support human rights, demand empathy for our neighbors, including people we might viscerally disagree with, or who look differently, or pray differently, or have a different sexual orientation or gender identity. We must reject the too simple formula that sees mileage from promoting hate and exclusion of others, any others. Thank you very much.
Again, that was wonderful. There's an awful lot to think about there. I guess I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. If anybody has anything, please type in now. You could also raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask directly. I'll just give everyone a moment to formulate questions or comments. Okay, we've got a hand from
Willow, I see.
Yes, Willow.
Hi, so listening to what you said about counter speech, it would be safe to assume that you'd be generally against legislation that would limit speech that has been shown historically to lead either to credible threats of violence or like violence themselves, even if that speech doesn't include that.
One of my parts of my background is I'm a lawyer too. One of the tests for speech is whether there's an imminent threat, and whether there's some an existential problem at the moment. So to give you an example, I can go on a street corner and say, I think all, whatever should be killed. I can say that. I can't say that if I'm saying with a bunch of skinheads and there's a person who I'm vilifying that's across the street and the skinheads have a back. So, there's a threat assessment level that's part of that too. But, there was a debate about the anti-Semitism definition when I think it was South Carolina was looking at it. And there was a rabbi who wrote an opinion piece that said that Hitler himself didn't kill anybody with his own two hands. All he did was speak. And how can we let that type of speech be heard? And a friend of mine who's a former official at the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, who wrote, we're concerned as much as this rabbi was, but part of the problem with Nazi Germany was not only the speech, it was also defining which views are correct and which aren't, and punishing dissent. And it was no coincidence that the Association of Jewish Studies linked professors in South Carolina also wrote saying, wait a minute, if you're going to start looking at speech in and of itself in our classrooms and elsewhere, you're going to stop us having the ability to effectively teach, to look at ideas. And it bothers me, particularly in a university setting, because you want to give students the capacity to play out with ideas, to be wrong, to think as young people, how am I going to recalibrate my thinking through the rest of my life? How am I going to change my opinions? How do I test my opinions? And when you have the state defining that certain types of opinions are ones that are disfavored, whether it's about Jews or anybody else, to me, that's a problem. So yeah, I'm much more interested in effective methods there are lots of things in my book about, about anti-Semitism that are using the tools of the campus effectively to bring out ideas and to shape debate. And the idea of shutting down certain ideas is inherently dangerous, is in my view inherently dangerous.
Okay, there's a question in the Q&A. I think this is about the statistics you mentioned with regard to religious hate crimes. It says you talked earlier about religious hate crimes. Was that in the US alone or worldwide?
Yes,
Also,
it's the US.
Okay.
Department of Justice stats, and the latest available are 2022, but you can go back many, many years in the Department of Justice. Just Google Department of Justice hate crime stats.
Okay, excellent. And question from Elise Helford. I'd like to hear more about what a hate studies program at a university looks like.
Great question. So there are a few now. I mean, the first one, and I had a hand in putting it together at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. And there are different pieces of it that different places are taking up. So Gonzaga put together a conference that happens every 2 years, which is really an amazing thing to go to. The last one was virtual, but before that, to bring people together who are working on different aspects of hate, and they may be overlapping but not realizing it, because the anthropologists are here and the sociologists are there. But when you bring them together, and especially after dinner when you give them a good scotch or a martini, they realize how much their work connects. So there's that. Gonzaga does is a journal of hate studies that comes out annually. That's also very important. There are some that focus more on looking at hate crime, like one in Canada and this one in Limerick in Ireland, that look at hatred, but trying to drive through how do we think about hate crime more holistically? What do we have to do to combat it? What should we be doing with the police forces and others? And what I'm doing at Bard is a couple of things. One is that we have the first hate studies initiative in the course catalog. And it's interesting because when I first started the program, I was talking to a lot of different faculty and saying, are you interested in this, giving them the definition? And they didn't realize how many people from different fields actually do something that intersects that definition. It may not be the total core of the course, but not only history and religion and anthropology, but even in the arts, even in literature, even in photography. There are things that people do that look at the capacity to define an us and a them and then demonizing and dehumanizing. So basically, the easiest thing is to just sort of identify that as in the course catalog, saying these are courses that intersect hate, to underscore that we're looking at that. And I hope one of these years we'll actually be able to have a concentration or a major in hate. This is sort of the same trajectory that human rights courses developed on. So that's one thing. Second thing is we're trying to support new research that looks at this nexus of how do we deal with hatred in the real world and how do we understand it in the academy. So to give you a couple of examples, one is we have a study that came out by a political scientist that looked at the state of hate index. And what he did was he said, let's go geographically, state by state, and have a bunch of different metrics, hate crime for sure, but anti-LGBTQ laws, other things as well, and then rank the states, because it's a different level of protection and danger when you go across the state line. And so we had a ranking, and not surprisingly, Idaho and Montana came out worse than New York and Hawaii. But that's one thing we did. The second thing, and this is a very involved thing, we're just taking a baby step into it, is I've always been curious about what's the economic cost of hate. I mean, we quantify everything, right? Potholes or global warming or whatever. We don't do that with hate. So we're having a study that's going to come out probably in the fall that takes the first slice of this, thinking about what's the economic cost of hate crime. Then we're also going to have, probably in early 2024, a book that's going to come out from the center that's looking at the connection of the academics who have some knowledge about hate, from philosophy to anthropology to different fields, to the NGOs that think that they're working on hatred. I can tell you, having worked at one, and I think we did, the agency did great work. I'm not just talking about, my work, particularly the agency did good work, but there was never any, how do we know what we're doing and it's effective? So connect those conversations. We're going to have a book that's going to direct, the theories towards the main audience, not the only audience, of NGO officials, so that they can think of how they calibrate what they do and evaluate it and so forth. Another thing that we're going to do is, as a part of social media issues, that people are always talking about what should be on social media, what regulations should there be. I'm looking at the flip side of it. I'm taking the example that I gave you about what happened in Montana, saying what else can be out there that we can use social media much more effectively. And there's an idea to put together a clearinghouse on hate, so when somebody's victimized by it or wants a resource or wants to learn more, it's easier to find. So that's what we're doing at BARD. But there's so many things about hatred that one can do, and it's in the academic community. And I could tell you that when the first couple of years before the pandemic, I used to go up once every couple of weeks and lead a faculty reading group on hate. So there were people from social psychology and philosopher, religion, different fields, political science. And when they sat together, especially again when I applied them with wine and food, the ability to think, oh, I could use that in my teaching. I could use this in my teaching. So there's many, many ways of doing this. I'm not saying that we're doing them all. I think we're just scratching the surface. So I'm happy if anybody, in your world wants to discuss what might work for you. I'm happy to have that conversation. Again, my email is kstern@bard.edu.
Really interesting. I'm interested to hear about the hate crime center in Limerick. I've worked in Ireland and Northern Ireland and Protestants and Catholics, and obviously that's the hate studies has a lot of relevance there as well. We've got a bunch of 4 questions in the Q&A. Some of them related.
It's appropriate for Passover. What can I say?
Right. Are there any particular conspiracy groups that are concerning as far as their beliefs rooted in anti-Semitism? Like any specific, groups to be aware of, I guess, in the US?
Well, what concerns me, I think back to the Oklahoma City bombing and the conspiracy theories that were driving a lot of, it's white supremacists to the core, but there were conspiracy theories, which is why, there was a lot of fervor and attention to, to what actually unfolded in the anniversary of Waco. So there was conspiracy theory driving this extreme set of folks. But, one of the things that I think about is that the way that they looked at the world, what would have happened if you had a leader or millions of people who saw the world this way, rather than, tens of thousands who were arming themselves and seeing that it was noble to fight the federal government as the source of all evil, with these conspiracy theories about, the ones back then were about black helicopters and secret signs on the back of road signs for the concentration camps, and all that stuff that made sense to them if they saw the world through this narrow view, where anything that was counter to them was seen as further proof of the conspiracy. I mean, there's the type of thinking that I saw some graffiti when I was a freshman at BARD, over 50 years ago, that always stuck with me. It said, if I didn't believe it with my own mind, I never would have seen it. And there are a lot of people who see the world that way. I'm worried about now, not about the Oath Keepers and those folks. I'm worried about them, but I'm worried about how many millions of people believe this alternative universe. At a dangerous time, not only here. I mean, people believe about the election being stolen and so forth, but look inside Russia and how many people believe the tale that's being told there, that they're fighting Nazis and this is noble and we're doing again what we did in World War II, and how can anybody criticize us? They're vilifying. It's again looking at the world in that way. It's comforting. It gives people purpose. It makes you feel part of a team, and it's frightening.
Got a couple of questions about kind of the anti-Semitism on the left and right. One is says you spoke about seeing anti-Semitism on the political left and right, but most of your examples have been from the political right. Could you speak more on how it manifests in the political left? And then a second one, similar from Tommy, Marjorie Taylor Greene will say things that are not only anti-Semitic but crazy. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib also seem to have an anti-Semitic slant. Which party do you feel is more a friend of Israel Democrats, Republicans, and I actually had a similar question about, in Britain, there's been a big problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party on the left. It's led to kind of the crumbling of leadership and so on in recent years there. So yeah, I guess just could you speak more generally about anti-Semitism, maybe specifically on the left?
I'll speak to both things. I think it's important for us intellectually to sort of separate the Israel part from the anti-Semitism part, because again, what worries me is that we diminish anti-Semitism, define it narrowly or define it expansively, depending on if the people share our view of Israel. Trump was seen by many as a great friend of Israel. He moved the embassy. He did a lot from the point of view of some of the more conservative folks in the Jewish community here, and certainly from some of the Israelis. But as I said, he helped promote anti-Semitism. His, calls about the invaders and we have to stop them seems like it helped empower Bowers, who went and shot up the Tree of Life. So I think it's important to divorce this, and also some of the people that are very supportive of Israel among some segments of evangelical Christians. What's the reason for their support? Their support is because their theology tells them that Jews have to be ingathered, and those that don't convert don't end up so well for the second coming. That's overlooking that to say, well, because of support of Israel, it becomes complicated. And I think we need to look at anti-Semitism again, about conspiracy theory about Jews, and not to give a free pass or vilify somebody because of the Israel stuff. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's elected, she has an audience. You and I may think that she's crazy. There are many people that don't. So she's saying something that's internally consistent and has an audience, and that's worrisome. And whether she keeps going to these tropes about Nazism, and COVID and so forth, it may be because it plays with her basis. With Tlaib, she's Palestinian, and she's played along with look, a Palestinian may have a different point of view when it comes to positions about Israel. I get it. Zionism, the Jewish state, is a challenge for people there. So it may be, that has to be part of the equation. Once she's gone into tropes, and when Ilhan Omar has gone into tropes, that strikes me as also problematic. And when Ilhan Omar did it repeatedly, even after she apologized, I also wonder if you see some political mileage in it too. So I'm not here to psychoanalyze anybody, but I'm saying that it needs to be called out on all sides, even though, the example that I gave with Pat Buchanan wrote books, had a much longer track record. He dabbled in Holocaust denial. So it was easier to sort of see where he was coming from if he said something like that than somebody that's more recent. In the Labor Party, yeah, there were concerns with, again, it was, the politics of just going down and seeing the black and white, not the complexities and things about Israel. I have less problem with them staking out a political position that I may disagree with, and more about turning a blind eye to how people, simply because they were Jews or supporters of Israel, were getting harassed and intimidated. And it was interesting. That's one of the things that happened with the definition. There was an attempt to say, okay, use the definition to, it was adopted by the Labor Party, but use it as an investigation by the government to conclude about whether there was a problem of anti-Semitism in the Labor Party. The investigating group declined to use the definition and found that under the Equalities Law, I believe, in the UK, it was sufficient to find that there was a problem. And that's part of the parallel here. And I don't see any deficiency in our current laws, whether it's Title VI, and I've brought anti-Semitism cases, or other aspects of our law to deal with issues of anti-Semitism where it may appear. But the bringing in these types of laws of using the definition, again, will go after pro-Palestinian speech. To give you an example of what happened in the UK, it was adopted, and there was a Israel Apartheid Week event that was supposed to happen on a campus, and there was a protest by a Jewish communal group to the government and to the campus, and the event was stopped. Now, again, I'm no fan of Israel Apartheid Week, but it's not violent, it's political speech. And then what happened here in the US is the Simon Wiesenthal Center said, oh, that's great, everybody should adopt it here and use it to stop similar events in the United States. That's not how you do it. People should have a discussion about where they disagree about Israel and apartheid, not stop certain speech. And again, that gives the impression that Jews who are Israel supporters can't make a case, that they need government to step in on their side. And it makes it so that it seems that Jews are trying to silence others. And that, to me, is a recipe for increasing anti-Semitism, not decreasing it.
We have, we're just a little bit past 4. Do you have time for one more?
I can't hear you. Are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Well, hold on a second.
Okay.
Let me hear. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Let me just cover 1 second. I'm having the problem with the earbuds again. I'm gonna. Oh, no, okay. Let me just throw them out of the room into a different room, and I'll be right back.
Okay. Okay. How about now? How about now?
Now I hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sorry about that.
It was nice that it waited until the very end to fail.
Yeah.
We have one more question in the Q&A. Do you have time to answer?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
As long as you need.
And it's an excellent one to end on. It's a request for more information. Alyssa Belton asks, can you recommend reading materials and or authors for someone who wants to learn more about this topic? I know you have several books. I know you have several books. So which would you recommend to start with?
There's so many books, and it depends what aspect of this you want. I mean, there are some, there are some that are like 5 volumes that look at the history. There's Deborah Lipstadt's book, which is more recent. There are a bunch that I have in different syllabi too. One of the things that the Bard Center does is we collect syllabi about hate. And there are a bunch of classes on anti-Semitism or aspects of anti-Semitism, so a lot of them are listed there. So rather than try to pick a abstract favorite book, let me suggest that you email me, and I'm happy to have a discussion about what you're particularly interested in, and then make a recommendation.
And I will add that Ken's most recent book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, actually does have, it starts with a great overview of, it's not just about Israel-Palestine. There's a great overview of hate studies in the field and kind of the evolution and all that. So that's also a good place to start. And I do happen to know that it's in the MTSU library, so I would definitely recommend that one. All right, well, if there are no more questions, I will, on behalf of everybody here, say thanks a lot. This was excellent. Fascinating way to spend a Thursday afternoon. Yeah, I appreciate it. We all do.
Thank you very much. Take care. Have a good rest of your day and good holidays.
All right, take care, everybody.
Good. Bye-bye.